Thank you very much for talking to me, Cathryn. You made contact with me, didn't you? Was it in 2019 when you found my website?
Yes, I was beginning to do some sort of family history research, and I knew there was something about Nan with the Goligher circle, and I just Googled it, and your website came up.
Because you were what age when you knew her?
Well, she died in 1972, so I would have been 20. So, and as I said to you, we were a family that was very close. We lived very nearby. So there were very few days as I grew up that didn't see her. I would have called in with her after school, had a cup of tea, had a chat. She was very involved in us when we were young, big help. There were 4 of us, so Mum would have been busy, and Nan was a great help.
I haven't got memories to go from, and you have. I've only got a few photographs. So how would you describe her smile, for instance?
She smiled a lot. She seemed a very happy person. I don't remember ever her being down about things. So my grandfather was very sociable. We always loved eating at her house because, as always, food tasted better if your gran made it for you.
So I'm always asking myself, how did William and Kathleen come to meet? Perhaps Kathleen, as a very bright young woman, attended the Belfast Municipal Technical Institute, where William was a teacher. And she wouldn't have attended that to learn from him, because he was teaching engineering, and women weren't allowed on that course. But they did have a women's work department, which was cooking and sewing, and some types of artistic endeavors. But
I certainly never heard anything about that. But then I didn't hear a lot about that stage.
you'd probably have known, wouldn't you, if she'd have gone and trained professionally?
Yes, I don't think so, because I mean, in the census she's recorded as a shirt cutter or something like that. I would have thought that the family, that they weren't obviously well off, and I would have thought the girls would have started work quite young.
That's what my researchers told me. I mean, they were an itinerant family. They moved around many different addresses within that very small area.
They also, I think at that stage, it says in one of William Crawford's books that they had joined a spiritualist church.
William's wife, Elizabeth, considered herself to have some spiritualist ability. And so, yes, you're right. That's probably the most likely way, isn't it, that they made contact, that they were both members of that spiritualist church. Does it make sense to you, knowing your grandmother as you did, that she was a spiritual medium?
No, it makes no sense at all. I was really very surprised about it.
How did you find out?
I saw an article in the newsletter in 1971.
Yeah, so the headline reads, "Suicide ? Or the doctor's last experiment."
And then there was a photograph of, and it was the photograph that I saw, and I thought, of course, that looks very like Nan. And I brought the article home and asked my mum, and she said, yes, that was her. So that was really the first that I had come across.
So you asked your mum about this strange and surprising discovery, and I get the impression, was your mum a bit cagey about it?
Well, she was. I think partly because my grandmother had breast cancer and was really not very well, and I expect Mum thought it would maybe upset her. I sort of thought if she hadn't told me about it, then there must be some reason. You see, my mother and my aunt didn't really know an awful lot about it either. But I think they thought that after Dr. Crawford killed himself, that the family stopped doing the seances. Now, you have since shown me evidence that they didn't stop doing it. In fact, the seances and the experiments went on till the early 1930s. maybe they just, when she got married and started to have a family of her own, maybe that was just something that was put in the past.
But what I think I find so incongruous about it is that she became world famous doing this. You know, Arthur Conan Doyle based some of his conclusions around spiritualism on William's experiments and on Kathleen's powers. Very powerful, very wealthy, influential men of her day knew who Kathleen Goligher was and also trusted in her powers. Harry Houdini writes about her in his memoirs. You know, this is not someone who's doing something for a bit of a lark with her friends. This was a fully applied number of years of her life where it was her vocation. And then to go from that to absolute silence, where even her own family don't know this past, it begs a big question, doesn't it, about was she protecting people from something, or was she ashamed of something, or was it too painful to think about?
I do regret, well, I regret that I didn't get a chance to speak to her specifically about it. But I feel very silly that I didn't then speak to my grandfather about it after she had died, because he obviously was involved at a later stage and must have known a little bit about what was going on. Well, probably knew quite a lot about what was going on. But when you're young, you don't sort of take these opportunities. You get on with your own life, don't you?
He would have known a lot. And I have to tread carefully here when I talk about this, because there will be people I know who disagree with my conclusions, but I have to be honest about my conclusions. And I've been honest with you, is that for whatever reason and for whatever motive, my personal understanding is that Kathleen was pretending to be able to speak to people in the afterlife. Why that is, we can speculate. You know, this is a time when Kathleen was from a very poor background. Even if she'd have been from a wealthy background, she had very little agency as a young woman. There was not much there were not many places for her ambition to take her. She was clearly a bright young woman who found herself, for whatever reason, in a position where she was able to hold court with much more powerful, influential people. That must have been quite an exhilarating thing for a young woman.
I don't know. I mean, she never struck me as somebody who was, she would never have been somebody who was looking for the limelight. She would have been very retiring, shy. I can't imagine her sort of glory seeking unless there was a complete change, and that's not the impression I get. You know, she seemed like a very caring person. She does sound, from Dr. Crawford's writings, that she was very interested in what was going on in the experiments. She wouldn't be somebody that I would have said was devious or had any guile in her. I mean, I do find it hard to believe in communicating with the dead. And if I'd read this or read any of the, because I read some of his books then, you know, when I heard about this, and I'd have thought I would have dismissed that out of hand with somebody I didn't know, but I cannot imagine her purposely fooling people.
And there will certainly be people who say that she wasn't. You know, she was absolutely authentic in her abilities. And Harry Houdini writes about people who sincerely and absolutely believe in their own powers, their spiritualist powers, but who feel a pressure to perform and to introduce theatre into their seances because what they can show isn't enough for people. That their ability to be able to commune with the dead is absolutely authentic to them, but people want to see things floating around the room, and they want to see trumpets, and they want to, you know, and they want to hear voices and raps, and so they mimic or affect those phenomena, not because they're devious, but because they feel this pressure to convince and to perform.
Well, as you say, I suppose their lives would have been not terribly exciting. They'd be working hard. I know my mum said that Nan would have done quite a lot of the sort of housekeeping duties when her mother was ill, and then when her mother died, she sort of took over looking after her father. So maybe these things were slightly out of the ordinary, as you say.
Do you think at the end of her life, she would quietly have been drawing on the early part of her life for comfort? Her belief in the afterlife, her belief in spirits?
There was never any sign of that, not that I was aware of.
Because that's the time you'd imagine, isn't it? If you were facing your own mortality, you would say to your loved ones, it's okay, I know who's waiting for me.
No, she never started, she didn't start to go to church or anything like that. No, I never got that impression that she would never have talked about that. Or
is it possible, do you think, that her older sister Rebecca and her husband were perhaps putting her under pressure around these seances? What was Rebecca like?
I think I maybe saw Rebecca when she was a very old lady. As I say, she left her family when she had 4 children, and she left and divorced Mr. Morrison, and she remarried. So I think I remember seeing an elderly lady in bed in a house, but her granddaughter, who I would see frequently and you met when you were over here, would have always felt that my grandmother was her grandmother rather than her real grandmother. She always found her slightly cold. So I get the impression that Rebecca was maybe a little bit cold, but wouldn't be right for me to comment on her whenever I never met her.
Do you remember there was a time when you were, I think you might have been quite little, I don't know, you tell me, but where you discovered something and it was the closest you came really to asking Kathleen about her past?
Well, I think that probably was the box of photographs. There were ordinary family photographs, obviously, but in amongst them, there was a little envelope and it had a lot of very strange photographs with obviously now what were supposed to be spirits and, ghostly sort of faces and things. So they weren't hidden away as such. I mean, they were in the family photographs, but I think I maybe asked what they were, and they said, "Oh, don't worry about them" or something. They weren't discussed. Nobody said. An opportunity wasn't taken to expand on what they were.
Just to go to the experiments that were carried out by Fournier de Albe, who investigated Kathleen and the Goligher circle after William Jackson Crawford took his life. That's where we have some additional photographs of Kathleen that are much clearer during seances. And we can add those to other pictures of supposed ectoplasm stretching out across the floor. Mm-hmm. The modern eye, I think you'd be hard pressed not to see that they were muslin strips of material or gauze. And there's one picture that's one of my favorites, because when I first saw it, it was like an electric shock. And that's a picture of Kathleen, and you can see a bit of twine going down the inside of her leg, and then above her belt into her top. So it's running through her clothes and then down to the floor. There was a moment for Kathleen when she was exposed by Fournier de Albe as being a false medium. Mm-hmm. When you imagine your grandmother being in that position, what do you think her response would have been?
I don't know. I expect if she really believed it, she would be very upset. But
to have Harry Houdini, one of the world's most famous men, in writing that you are effectively a con artist, must have been quite frightening.
I find it strange that they agreed to do the experiments with Fournier Dalb, you know, having done them all with Dr. Crawford, I can't see why they agreed to do them if they really thought that he might expose them.
And Elizabeth, William's wife, was there too. So after William took his own life, the circle continued with these experiments with Fournier Dalb, and like you say, Kathleen continued with them. But he writes in his report that he sees the shadow of her lifting a stool with her foot, and he's, to paraphrase, aghast that William took so long investigating but didn't manage to catch them out effectively. There are people who would say that Fournier Dalb was wrong, that William Crawford was right, that he didn't commit suicide because he had discovered he had been tricked. He committed suicide for other reasons, but believed he was going to the afterlife, and who died believing that Kathleen was a genuine spirit medium because she was. Do you think that's a possibility, that actually your grandmother was able to speak to the spirits?
Well, I don't believe you can speak to the spirits, so I can't I can't believe that.
But she believed it to the very end, though, because we have the evidence, don't we, that she called her house Nakoma, which was the name of her spirit guide.
She did, yes.
So even though she didn't speak about it to others, she chose to live in a building named after her spiritualist life.
I always thought that the timing of the Fournier Alb experiments was strange, in that it wasn't very long after her mother died. And I thought that was a very strange time to even ask her to do these. And I feel maybe the family shouldn't have agreed to do that at that time.
Yes.
They must have been grieving. They must have been grieving for her mother.
We know in some of the correspondence that she was not enthusiastic about continuing with the experiments. And from my point of view, I suppose, being kind of a Mr. Judgmental in today's world, looking back, I thought, well, of course she doesn't want to do them. She'll get caught out. And now, actually, after 3 or 4 years of learning more about the story, but also thanks to you allowing me to understand a little bit more about the woman that Kathleen was, as an honest, kind, sweet, humble, generous person, that actually maybe she didn't want to do them because she was grieving. Maybe she didn't want to do them because she was frightened. Maybe she was forced or felt forced into doing them, if not directly by other people in the family and other people in the spiritualist world at the time, then even just feeling under pressure to do it because of your own reputation and the world that you've built around yourself. You hear that with celebrities these days. We talk about celebrity in a very modern sense. Once you've built your fame and your profile and who you are up to such a degree, you then become a prisoner of it. I love speculating about this stuff, and I don't know, but I imagine this young woman caught in this whirlwind, really, where, you know, William's taken his life, she's lost her mother, but she still is under pressure from all those around her to be the spiritual medium, to speak to the spirits, to help people to commune with their lost loved ones, to continue to give Arthur Conan Doyle the evidence he needs to go on his tours.
Part of me thinks if they were carrying out some great scam, that they must have done it very well to escape being found out. Because when Dr. Crawford was doing his experiments, because reading what he did, they were very detailed experiments. You know, you're saying about her lifting the table with her feet, but quite a lot of the experiments, her feet were locked inside a metal box.
Fournier Dalb said that it wasn't she alone that was creating the phenomena. So if her feet were locked in the box, then someone else would be lifting the table, is his solution to that conundrum. And it would also be Houdini's solution to that conundrum. And he also said it's amazing how spiritual mediums are unable to create phenomena the first time you carry out an experiment, and then the second time when you come back and carry it out again, suddenly the phenomena appear, and it's because they've found a way around it. And I certainly find it interesting that they carried out a lot of these seances above a hardware shop or a plumbing supply shop, where you have a lot of twine and wire and spring and bits of wood and metal. I mean, you know.
But they did do it in Dr. Crawford's house and in other places as well. So it wasn't just there.
No, you're absolutely right. They did. Some of the photographs that are taken to be in Kathleen's or the Goligher's house, I believe actually were in Dr. Crawford's house. There's some famous wallpaper in the background of some of those seance shots, and actually they were taken in Dr. Crawford's house, he says in his books.
Right.
So there's some confusion around that. And I know that there's someone who claims that the seances were not carried out above the Morrison shop, but Fournier d'Albe is very specific about where they were carried out when he was experimenting, at least.
There certainly were some carried out there, because my cousin, her aunt and mother, they used to sit on, Rebecca's children used to sit on the staircase outside and listen.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that?
Because they told Kathleen.
Because they told
another source that we didn't tap at the time.
And are they lost to us now as well?
Yes, yeah.
The most tantalizing, frustrating thing about all of this is that you wouldn't even have to go that far back in time for us to be able to talk to these people.
No, absolutely not.
A couple of decades, and you'd be able to ask people some really interesting questions.
Maybe they were just really expert illusionists.
Well, I mean, Harry Houdini would certainly suggest that they were, absolutely. But the question is, for me, the question is not whether they were expert illusionists. I believe they were. For me, the question is whether they were creating illusions because they felt they needed to add some theatrics to their authentic powers and beliefs, or whether they really were just con artists who found some profit, be that financial or social profit or power or influence, in pretending to be able to speak to spirits. And when you look at the history of spiritualism from a, let's call it, Houdini-esque point of view, you can generally split people into one of those two camps. They're either doing it for some sort of profit, and it's quite a cynical, mercenary endeavor, or alternatively, it's people who genuinely believe they can speak to the spirits, but the demand for them to keep proving it means they have to, play a few card tricks and waft a ball around on the end of a bit of string.
Certainly what I've read would indicate that they were not charging people at seances, that they didn't take money. And Dr. Crawford says that, and he didn't ever pay them any money. I know you told me, I think Fournier d'Albe paid them, but...
The issue of remuneration is an interesting one, because while there are different ways to profit, right? So, for instance, some spiritual mediums certainly didn't accept payment. Many did, but those who didn't, they often benefited from bequests in people's wills. They might be given free food from the local greengrocers or the local butchers, or free coal, or they might be given discounts for things. It was used as a barter system. Yes, I'll help you talk to your great uncle, or I'll help you talk to your lost son. If I can have another pound of fish. There are other currencies, and taking even material goods out of it, or material wealth. If again you are someone who has very little agency in your society, you can't vote, you can't be involved in politics, you can't get a professional job, you can't really even train in anything. You're expected to be a housewife and a mother. The ability to be someone of social importance and relevance, and to, as I've said before, kind of hold court with powerful people and have them listen to you and respect and admire you and your powers would be quite beguiling. And that's got a value in its own right, hasn't it?
Yes, although that doesn't fit with what I would imagine my grandmother was like.
And that's where we keep coming back, isn't it? The mystery that is Kathleen Goligher, and she will continue to be. I think that's quite nice, actually. In a way, it's lucky that she's not around to be questioned by me
Are
or
you?
else. Well, me or anyone else, in a way, because she chose in her own lifetime to remain very private about it, didn't she?
Mm-hmm. There must be some reason for that. So she was happy to move on with her life, and I think she had a very fulfilled life.
For me, the most interesting question about this story, and I didn't start writing my novel asking myself it, but it's one that's come to the fore, I think, just in telling the story in my own way, is the question around who is an abuser and who's being abused. Because much of the conversation that's been had around these experiments that Dr. Crawford carried out on Kathleen has presented Kathleen as a victim of a man of power, and that there was possibly a sexual element to his interest in Kathleen. For me, I think there's probably some truth to that, but I also see that Kathleen was beguiling a mentally unstable man, and whether she was doing that, I don't believe she was doing it maliciously, but what the reasons why she was doing that we've discussed, we don't know. But that interplay between those two characters as to who's the aggressor in the situation and who's the victim, mm-hmm. is something that we're obsessed with in society right now. But if you put it back in those days, would you look back and see possibly your grandmother as being the victim of an oppressive and manipulative, grooming man?
He didn't sound like an aggressive man. Reading how he described the family, maybe they were both victims of just circumstances of his experiments, and at that time, around the war and everything, spiritualism and talking to the dead was that was your therapy, wasn't it? There wasn't grief counselling. People found it very beneficial, a lot of people. So I don't know who was victim or who was, maybe they both were victims of what happened.
What do you think she'd make of my book?
I know my mother would be horrified. My mother would have been very private about it, but I don't know. I think she probably would be surprised, and because she wouldn't ever sort of put herself up as somebody important. Or I said to you, Andy, you're writing a novel. You're not writing her biography. None of us know exactly what happened. Like you, I can't believe that she was speaking to the spirits. So there must be some skullduggery going on, but I can't imagine her doing anything bad or hurtful. And we'll never really know the real answer.